Hi everyone and welcome back to this new True Crime Tuesday upload schedule that I'm doing. I'm not trying to disrespect anyone involved in the case or any of the family. I'm just basically gathering a load of evidence and research that I've done online and then putting it into an educational video for you. In 2003, a successful businessman named Neil Chohan was the owner of a fruit importation firm based at Heathrow Airport named Seba Freight. He lived with his wife and 2 children and her mother. He was known as a family man and a really easygoing boss. The company was said to have like a relaxed atmosphere, everyone got on, everyone were all friends, and they'd order like pizzas and stuff together to eat as like a group, like a little family. But due to having this large freight company at Heathrow Airport, it made Neil Chohan an easy target. In January of 2003, a recently received convict named Kenneth Regan arrived at Seba Freight looking for work. As Neil Chohan had previously spent time in prison for tax evasion, he was up for the idea of giving people a second chance. So he was very sympathetic towards Regan, who came saying that he'd like a second chance and he'd like to prove himself and actually work again.
Neil was a very fair person. He'd always give people not a second chance, but a 10th chance. He'd been in prison himself, and obviously he'd had a second chance, so why shouldn't anybody else?
And then Regan was then employed as a driver at Seba Freight. 5 years earlier to this, Regan had actually been a successful drug smuggler known to his friends as Captain Cash. He had set up a lot of different freight companies around Heathrow Airport, using those as a front to bring drugs into the country. He was said to have been living the high life and just constantly bringing money in. During this time, Regan met a woman before he went to prison named Belinda Bruin. Belinda does actually play quite an important part towards this whole case, as we'll uncover later on into the video.
He was a bit rough, I think. Not well educated, quite charming, dressed well, nice watch, spent a lot of money. He was kind of like a rich, wide boy.
She said that he also carried around a briefcase which was full of money, and he tried to play it off as if he was somewhat more important than what he actually was. And then, unknowingly to Belinda, she would be brought into his world of crime. Regan started to become obsessed with Belinda, and he would leave her phone calls, send her emails declaring his love for her. Belinda obviously found this to be quite bizarre because they didn't really know each other. They'd only known each other a few times from seeing each other at like bars and stuff. One day, a friend of Belinda's asked her why she was going out with a man like Kenneth Regan, and she replied she wasn't. But it turns out that Regan had actually been going around telling everyone that they were in a relationship and that she was his girlfriend. Days later to this, on June 17th, 1998, Regan was found with 25 kilograms of heroin. Facing 8 years in prison, he became a grass. His testimony helped convict 12 major criminals whilst reducing his own sentence. Regan was released from prison 4 years later from his sentencing, and when he got out he had very little friends and also very little money as everything was stripped of him due to the confiscation order. Regan wanted to get back into the drug dealing business as soon as he got out of prison, not really learning anything from his time in there. He saw Neil Chohan's business the perfect opportunity to get back into it. Regan came up with a plan to steal Neil Chohan's business, and with hopes that nobody would have even realised that this event had taken place. The start of this plan was soon after Regan started working at Seba Freight and when he set a trap. He said to Neil Chohan that he knew some investors that were interested in buying the company and said that these investors would offer Neil Chohan £3 million. This was obviously a nice sum of money, and Nancy, Neil's wife, was actually wanting him to retire so that they could move back to India. Prior to this, Neil Chohan did actually speak to his employees about wanting to move back and said that Nancy would really like to move back. So whilst this offer was being considered by Chohan, Regan was planning the next step of this operation. Whilst Regan's original plan was to get back into the drug smuggling business again and take over Seba Freight, it was also to go back and acquire Belinda Bruin. During the time Regan was in prison, all the obsessive calls and emails sent to Belinda had stopped, and Belinda had actually moved out of her home in Chelsea and gone over to Devon to live in the countryside. She wanted to completely start a new life and get out of the city. So as I say, these emails and calls had stopped until Regan actually got back out of prison. He began pursuing Belinda once again. He would leave her lots and lots of messages with regards to business deals that he had in mind and asking her to give him a ring. Regan told Belinda that he was planning to take over Seba Freight and needed a new managing director. Although Belinda had no relevant skills or any qualifications to do this job, Regan actually initially offered Belinda £54,000 for this 2-day week, but Belinda said that that was obviously too low for her. So Regan pleadingly offered a higher amount of £72,000 for just 2 days, and then Belinda obviously took this offer up.
A few weeks after he got out of prison, he left me a few messages on my mobile. He said that he had a business deal he wished to discuss with me. And at the time, I had this huge house, a huge mortgage, and 2 kids at private school when I'd given up my job and then my boyfriend left me. So it was, how can I put it? Yes, so I rang him.
This job offer gave Regan any excuse to go visit Belinda over in Devon, and would make up strange, reasons why he needed to come and visit, like needing a paper signing or filling a form out. And he would drive from Salisbury or London to her home in Devon, which was 3 hours just one way for a 20-minute trip, and that's all it'd be, and then he'd go back again. When Regan would visit Belinda, he would become obsessed with the surrounding areas and the land that she had around her house. He would suggest things that he'd like to include around the house, things including a drainage ditch. By February, Chohan had made up his mind about the offer that Regan had initially given to him, and he decided that he'd meet up with the investors. On the Thursday before Valentine's Day, Chohan left his office telling his workers that he was off to a business meeting. This was located at Stonehenge.
He said, I'm going off to do a deal and sell the company. He said, and I'll let you know. And that was the last time I saw him.
On the following Monday, the Seabear employees were all gathered round by Regan, who came bearing some news for them. Regan explained that Chohan had sold the company to these investors, and that Belinda Bruin, who he introduced as the new managing director of the company. This came as a shock, and Chohan had not actually mentioned anything to any of the employees about selling the company. So, as I say, they were like a big family, so if it was going to happen, he would have told them. But because of how busy the workers were, they couldn't just dwell on it. They had to get back into doing the work, so no real questions were actually asked.
You just had to go and get on with the work because it was a busy company. You would have to get on with the work and get the work done.
Belinda was given a desk and told to start examining the books that Regan had given her to basically learn how to do this job. On the second day of work, Belinda actually fell ill, and instead of letting Regan know, she just drove back to her home in Devon, and she saw an old-looking Jaguar on her driveway and 2 men in her field, and these men were with a digger. The 2 men were William Hornsey and Peter Reese, who were actually friends of Kenneth Regan. Belinda obviously went mad and asked them what they were doing, and they replied, well, making a drainage ditch. Shortly after, Regan arrived, and Belinda was obviously so angry with him and was like, I've not had this authorised, I've not given you permission to do this, what are you doing? 12,000 miles away in New Zealand was Onka Verma, a journalist who was actually the brother to Nancy, who was the wife of Neil Chohan. Onka was planning on a visit to see his sister over in the UK, as they hadn't seen each other for 9 whole years.
I was very excited because I was going to see Nancy after 9 years, and it was like a family reunion after a long time.
The two used to speak to each other every single day, but on the 15th of February, this stopped. Onka phoned Nancy and his mother, who lived with the Chohan family, and there was still no answer, from any of them, so Onka obviously knew something must have been up, because there was always the contact there. He then, over from New Zealand, decided to call the Met Police and ask for a routine missing persons check, and this check came back ensuring that the home was actually, in fact, empty. After the police had been speaking with neighbours, they kind of came to a conclusion that the family had moved back to India, as Nancy had actually mentioned to a lot of them that she had dreams and wished to go back. Onka decided that he was going to take it upon himself to go find his family, and he travelled over to the UK, as he didn't believe that they had just gone to India without announcing it or telling anyone, because, as I say, Onka and Nancy had the communication every single day, so surely if they was going to do something big like that, then Onka would have been made aware. When Onka arrived in the UK, he went straight over to the Chohan family home in Hounslow, and as soon as he walked in, he was completely shocked by what he saw.
As I entered the house, I could see the kids' toys on the floor, the baby feed bottles, all the baby feed and the clothes, they were still in the house. I opened the fridge, there was uncooked food inside.
He became a lot more suspicious after finding the food and everything, but one thing that stood out to him was his mother's prayer book. This was just left, and it was something that she carried around with her all the time. So to see that just left on the side, it was very peculiar that it wasn't in her possession. Onka then decided to go to the police and then ensured that they launched a full investigation. DCI Andy Rowell started off his investigation by interviewing the last person that Neil Chohan had seen, which was Kenneth Regan. Regan told them that Chohan was trying to sell his business, and also trying to say that Chohan was in deep water with his financial situation and didn't have a choice but to disappear. The police seemed a little unconvinced by Regan's story. Using new technology which allowed the police to track mobile phones of Kenneth Regan and Neil Chohan, it was able to show their movements on the day of the disappearance. Neil Chohan was seen to be in the Hounslow area and then tracked the phone to the Stonehenge area. Regan lived not too far from Stonehenge in a village called Wilton in Salisbury. From the phone tracking, police were able to see that Neil Chohan and Kenneth Regan actually met up on that day, and then after meeting, both their phones going down towards Exeter. The only lead police were able to have in Devon was that of Belinda Bruin, so they decided to pay her a visit.
When Regan found out that the police were coming to my house, he was furious. And he said to me, you know, you mustn't allow the police to come to your house. They'll just cause you aggravation. Once they get a foot in your house, you mustn't let them come to your house. I want you to phone them back and go and meet them somewhere else. And I thought, well, why would I want to do that?
Later that day, DCI Rowell received a phone call from one of Regan's associates, which was William Hornsey, and he came bearing information about Neil Chohan. He claimed that he had recently spoken to Chohan and that the missing businessman was still in the UK and just on the run. Hornsey said that he was going to meet with Chohan in Newport, Wales by the passport office to supply him with stolen passports, basically saying to the police that he was happy to deliver Chohan into the police's hands. Belinda then got a phone call from DCI Rowell saying, "Thanks for offering to help out, but we won't be needing to speak to you anymore," meaning Regan had managed to divert the police from going to speak with Belinda. Regan then rang Belinda to check if the police had cancelled the meeting, which Belinda was obviously confused about because, well, how did he know about that? He then told Belinda that they were actually off to Wales to go arrest Neil Chohan. The meeting with Chohan was supposed to take place on Easter Monday, but over the weekend, Belinda had received an unexpected visit from Regan, Hornsey and Reese. Regan said that he was there to do the lane, and the group brought a digger and Belinda had agreed to let them do the lane by the stables. Belinda then went out to town with her two kids, leaving the three to get on with the work. 2 days later, the police travelled to the spot where Hornsey said that he would be meeting Neil Chohan, and there was something about the passport meeting place that kind of stuck out as like a Mickey take, maybe, to the police. And it was that there was a statue of a pig in the exact place where Hornsey had said to meet them. The men then arrived where they said that they was going and stood around for a few minutes and then pretended to get a phone call, kind of looking a bit puzzled and showing with their body language that they were like obviously in some sort of distress and had to leave. The men claimed to have received a message saying, "We know you've told the police, we're friends of Neil Chohan's, the deal's off." The police then did retrace that call but found it was to an unregistered phone. Whilst Regan was at work, the police then reverted back to the original idea of speaking with Belinda Bruin. She was then called in for questioning, but before she left, Regan actually stopped her and said, "If the police ask what I was doing on your property, tell them that I was helping with your water system." And Belinda was obviously quite confused as to why he'd said this. Under questioning, Belinda had actually been asked if she knew what had gone on, and she just basically said, "I don't know, I've told you everything that I know." And then they said to her, "Is there anything that you find odd about this situation?" And Belinda explained that when she was leaving work, Kenneth Regan told her not to mention what he'd actually been doing on her land and to say that he was helping with a water system. And then the police were like, "Well, what was he doing?" And she said, "Building a drainage ditch." The police then obviously looked at each other and were like, "He's doing what?" Detectives then rushed to Tiverton, expecting to find a gruesome discovery. Upon arrival, a lot of forensic scientists came up to exhume the dig site, examining any fingerprint DNA evidence by highly trained archaeologists and pathologists. The next 5 days were then spent digging through Belinda Bruin's fields, with the expectation of finding a body, but no bodies were found. In April of 2003, the search for Neil Chohan's body and the rest of his family had been going on for 2 months, but they had been looking in the completely wrong place. 2 men, a father and son, had actually planned to go out canoeing in one afternoon. In Bournemouth, Dave and Carl Chapman went out a little further in their canoes than they usually would. After a while out at sea, Dave spotted something floating. Upon close inspection, it appeared to be like 3 floating objects. As he got closer, Carl actually mentioned that he had seen something earlier, but not really taken any notice or paid any attention to it. But until Dave shouted "body," they were both shocked and Carl obviously went to go take a closer look. There were feet sticking out of the water and the head and torso face down. Carl went back in to call 999 to inform them of the discovery. The body was then taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth, but it took a week to be identified as that of Neil Chohan's. After inspection of the body, they found that Neil had a blunt trauma injury to the back of his head, and he also had duct tape around his mouth, and this was the most likely cause of death. Whilst Chohan's clothes were being removed for forensic analysis, 100 miles away, police were still searching for evidence that he was buried in Belinda Bruin's field. The site of the dig actually became very important, as quite a lot of evidence was actually recovered from the site, like hairs, jewellery, clothing, which did lead police to believe that it initially was a burial site for the family. Those hairs were then identified as Neil Chohan's, and he at some point would have been buried in this site at this place in Devon, and then exhumed from the grave, put into a boat and then dumped in the sea in Bournemouth. Back at Seaber Freight, the workers were hopeful that Neil Chohan was alive and well and he would be coming to pay a visit. Like, even if he did sell the company, like, just for like a friendly chat and a catch-up with the workers. As I say, they were really close. Once they had confirmation about Neil Chohan's death, the concern grew to the whereabouts of where Nancy was and the kids and her mother. The police started piecing together evidence to try and find out where the rest of the family was, and put two and two together by the fact that Belinda Bruin's field, the dig site that they were on, was much larger for just one person. Then piecing this together with the whole family had disappeared, and that they'd found jewellery and also poppers that you'd find on a child's like baby grow, this was more likely from Nancy and obviously the kids. The police then believed that from finding this evidence that Nancy, her mother and the two babies were also buried at this site, the entire investigation became a Category A investigation. This is the highest category of a murder inquiry, and now at this point Kenneth Regan was labelled as prime suspect. One day Belinda was actually out seeing to her horses and noticed that one of their coats had ripped, so she took it off and put it into the car. She then headed back up the lane to her house. As she was driving back up the lane towards her house, she spotted Regan and Hornsey sat in a car just in a lay-by. Regan wound the window down and said that he needed to speak to her, and Hornsey said, "Yeah, get in the car, let's go for a coffee." Belinda replied that she had to go take this horse blanket back to a neighbour who was just up the road and she'll be back after, and they said okay. So she drove off around the corner and got straight on the phone to DCI Rao. He then sent 2 police officers over, and when the police officers arrived, Regan and Hornsey had actually gone. They had both escaped to Europe, leaving Peter Reese on his own. Alone and on the run, Reese started to develop a guilty conscience. Back in the UK where Reese actually was, he moved into a boarding house. He then began confessing his crimes to a woman named Wendy Powell. He began his conversation with asking Wendy if she'd seen him on TV, and Wendy replied no, because he didn't look like a celebrity or anything, so she was obviously a bit like, no, why?
And he just said that he was involved with an Asian family that had disappeared. They could put me at the scene of where the bodies were buried, but I didn't kill anybody. He was going, you know, they can't do that, they can't pin that on me. And I'd say to him, you know, what is going on, you know? He just said that Regan was crazy because he killed 2 children. I gasped, and I said, who were they killed? He said that Regan had shot them. It was Regan, he's a psycho, he said. He killed them all.
After Wendy heard about what happened, what she'd been described to her, she then reported that straight to the police. After 12 days on the run, after Wendy had made the police aware, Peter Reese was arrested at a nearby pub, but despite his confession to Wendy, he didn't want to answer any questions that the police were asking him, therefore refusing to basically tell the police where the Chohan family were. 3 weeks later to this, a fisherman discovered a body floating in the sea. Uncle was informed about this body that was found and taken over and basically looked over the body, and he identified that it was in fact Nancy's. Kenneth Regan was actually tracked down by police 2 months later to this in Belgium, and 6 weeks later William Hornsey actually gave himself up. Although all 3 suspects were in custody, they were all refusing to answer any questions and give up the whereabouts of where the Chohan family were. So 3 family members were now missing and there was no witnesses. This led police to need hard evidence to be able to prosecute these men. In April of 2005, the longest criminal trial in history of the Old Bailey began. Police were trying to prove that Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey and Peter Reese had abducted and murdered all 5 members of the Chohan family. The 9-month trial showcased 4,500 different exhibits, from financial transactions to petrol receipts. But as I mentioned before, the mobile phone tracking was the main piece of evidence that they were able to piece a storyline together. After tracking the mobile phones down to Salisbury, the police were able to establish that all the phones stopped at 3 Forge Close, and actually 3 Forge Close was in fact Kenneth Regan's home address. This led police to believe that he was actually being held there, as the mobile phones weren't ever not in that area during that time. Now this placed all 3 men at the scene, but the police still weren't 100% sure on what had actually happened to Neil Chohan. During the trial, however, police did unexpectedly receive some substantial pieces of evidence, and these pieces of evidence actually came from one of the relatives of the suspects. It was actually William Hornsey's son who provided police with this evidence. There was a Lexmark colour printer and a grey suitcase. The grey suitcase contained a lot of A4 pieces of paper with Neil Chohan's signature on them. These documents with his signature would have been able to prove to the employees at Siebert that he in fact did sign over the documents, making it a lot more believable when he went to introduce himself and then Belinda Bruin. This obviously shows that he was held at 3 Forge Close and forced to sign these papers under his duress. The suitcase contained 10 sheets of A4 paper containing Chohan's signature, which I presume he would have used at a later date if any other documents needed to come in. From the mobile phone tracking, police were able to see that Reese and Chohan stayed all the time at 3 Forge Close, whilst Regan and Hornsey travelled back to London, to Sutton Road in Hounslow, where the Chohan family lived. The men were there for several hours, and this is where the police believe that Nancy, her mother, and her 2 babies actually got killed. The police searched the home and couldn't find anything, but then soon came to realise that the whole room had been redecorated. New carpets had been laid down, new sofas had been put in, the walls had been painted. This was obviously done to cover up a crime scene, but there was still no proof. After 8 months of Neil Chohan being in storage after his body was found in the sea, the forensic scientists had actually left out a vital piece of evidence, and this was actually a clue left by Neil Chohan himself. The first bit of evidence was Neil Chohan's right sock that was removed from him, which was taken from the post-mortem in Dorset for examination. Socks, however, aren't really seen as a vital piece of evidence, so they're kind of ignored most of the time because they don't really hold too much DNA evidence on them. But for complete analysis, the police insisted that this sock and other pieces of his clothing were examined, so then they were sent over to the scientists. When the sock was unfolded and the scientists were looking inside, there was a piece of folded up paper. It's a letter from Cheltenham, Gloucestershire Building Society, and it's addressed to Mr. Regan of 3 Forge Close and dated the 12th of February 2003. This letter found in Neil Chohan's sock actually proves that he was being held captive at 3 Forge Close, and managed to somehow, at some point, slip this letter unnoticed into his sock, therefore knowing his life was in danger and that he wouldn't make it out of there, which makes it even worse to think about, because he knew what was coming up. After the 9-month trial, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Peter Reese was sentenced to 23 years for the murder of Neil Chohan. Regan and Hornsey each received 5 consecutive life sentences for the murder of the Chohan family. The remains of Nancy's mother were in fact found at a later date off the shores of Isle of Wight, but the bodies of the 2 babies, 18-month-old Devinda and 8-week-old Ravinda, have never been found to this day.
When I found Nancy's video was filmed just 2 days before the disappearance.
Hello? Nina, 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 Nina.
And I could see in the video the family celebrating life and the kids playing in the house. The eldest son, he took his first steps in the video, and my mom, she was very happy in the video.
So that brings us to the end of this very sad and quite disturbing video. I hope you found this informative, and if you did, please do leave a like because it really does help. And do make sure you subscribe for more if you are new. So yeah, thank you for watching.